Friends, I'm David Nace with EV World News, where we talk about electric vehicles, green technology, and the stock market. I am fortunate to be here today with Brian Wayne. And Brian, thanks for coming on to my show. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you for having me.
No, I love it. And you're with a company called Affinitiv.
Correct.
And tell me a little bit about what Affinitiv does.
Well, we do a little bit of everything, but primarily we supply marketing and software solutions, SaaS solutions for retailers. We do a lot of work with OEMs as well to provide not only the marketing solutions for, let's say, ongoing service retention, things like that, but even just to generate sales and to continue to keep your customers engaged through the life cycle of vehicle ownership from the time that they purchase to the time of their next purchase, so to speak. So
And when you say retail, you're specifically talking about auto dealers,
correct.
right? Okay. And so one of the things, and you're obviously coming on EV World News. We're here to talk about electric vehicles and how that impact plays out and is going to play out in the greater market. And we were just talking a little bit about, some of the things we consider, like I see a lot of things I consider to be misconceptions. And I'm sure that auto dealers have a lot of the same misconceptions that I see in the, general public. There's just so many things that kind of go on. But for starters, what are you guys seeing as far as growth in the EV field with the auto dealers and how that's affecting things?
Yeah, I think it's been pretty interesting, and the whole EV landscape to me is, and I think you and I kind of talked a little bit about it. It's just very interesting in itself. But I believe that there was much more anticipation that the shift would be a lot faster and greater. But there's still some challenges, right? The infrastructure remains a huge struggle for consumers and even OEs because range anxiety, regardless, is something that anybody I've spoken with, even current EV owners who have never had any issues, it's always on top of their mind, right? So I think that's a big piece of it. But a lot of it outside of that is, I think we're at roughly 7%, 7.1% market share right now on EVs. Probably will top out around 7.3 by the end of the year is what I'm seeing. But all these OEMs have made significant investments, billions upon billions of dollars to make this switch to EV. So it's going to happen at some point, probably. I think some of the stats that I've looked at look around 2025 or 2035, actually, you'll see 58%. So it won't even be 100% conversion, which I think is a lot of the, maybe some of the confusion out there. People think that it's going to be like a light switch and then all of a sudden everything on the road is going to be EV, but it'll take a long time to get there. I think you'll see hybrids become more in play because we're still, again, don't have that infrastructure. Gas prices remain high, but that solves a lot of the range anxiety issues because you'll still be able to travel some short distances on EV. And then at the point that you start running low, you shift over to your ICE engine and you can still continue on your journey without too much fear. So, I do think that those are some of the things that we're going to see.
Well, a lot of the things that I see by being, in the EV news space, I see all these new inventions that are coming up and things like that. And I see claims that by 2026 that EVs will hit the tipping point where they start actually being cheaper to purchase. And that will be a big piece because the batteries and you may have seen this news about the giga casting that Tesla's doing, where they're going
Yeah,
to bring down the cost of making the frame. Tesla's planning on coming out with the Model 2, which will be an even cheaper
right.
electric car. And I think you're going to see some big changes. One of the things that's interesting as we were talking about this, Tesla has a different model than the other car manufacturers, and that's been kind of interesting to see how they've been able to bring their cars to market without the franchise dealers. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, obviously that's a huge shift for certainly for the well-established OEMs and the retailer networks that are out there because they've had 100+ years of being in business together, and now you have this disruptor, if you will, in Tesla that's come to market and sells direct to consumers and all company owned, so they don't have, outside franchisees, so to speak, even as service locations. So it's a completely different dynamic, and obviously you need to look at it from a competitive standpoint. So how do the OEs then get into this space and be able to stay as competitive as, let's say, a Tesla, when there's these other layers that are involved? So that's something that ultimately I don't see the retailer setup going away anytime soon. And so I still think that that will be the viable way that the current OE network continues to do business going forward, unless there's something drastic that just requires something that's a little bit more, you know, of a big move to sidestep what's going on currently.
I just can't imagine that the current, way that Ford and Toyota and all them with the way they've been doing business, why that should be any worse than, Tesla's just a different company. They're trying something different. That doesn't mean it's necessarily. I think there's a lot of things that Tesla definitely does better. I mean, their charging network's definitely better. Your experience uh, as a Tesla owner is different than it is for other EV brands, especially in the United States, where our charging infrastructure on the road is weaker than in Europe and in other parts of the world. We lag behind there.
Yep.
And, as one of the things I keep kind of telling people in this industry is the United States and the big three have to figure out how to catch up, not just to Tesla, but to the Chinese. Because otherwise, what's going to happen is the big three are going to be out of business in 10 years. And you're just going to, the only US company that will be Tesla. And then you'll still have, several of your Japanese and others, but companies like BYD and NEO, who are not household names to most people, are going to be the big players. Obviously BYD is the biggest, and you're going to see some big changes.
Yeah, definitely. But I still, there's a lot of smart people at the OEs. And so I still think that they will figure out a way. One of the benefits, if you think about, especially some of these smaller startups, is there's a wealth and years and years and years of manufacturing expertise that they will certainly bring to this EV program, which, Tesla's had to kind of find their way through that, right? And these OEs have been doing it for years. So you talked about, as prices are going to drive down, and I think that's one of the things that will create that shift, because now they're buying these things at a much larger rate, so they'll have those cost consolidations that they have today on the ICE side of the house, right? That'll shift over to the EV world, so that'll drive the overall cost of these vehicles down. Then you couple that as you team up with these battery companies, which a lot of the OEs are doing, and then bring their technology, their IP in-house with the manufacturing expertise that the OEs have. And I think you've got a little bit more of a competitive model. So I do see them as certainly being ultra competitive, and they'll figure their way through this. They've been around a long time. I don't see them just going extinct anytime soon.
So what do you think the difference, and this is like an end consumer, what is the difference between an EV consumer and a non-EV consumer that you see at this point?
At this point, definitely think the lines are starting to blur a little bit more. But obviously, it tends to be more affluent, under 45 years of age. So it's still in that lower, younger generation. The older generation, like anything, when it's technology based, there's a little bit more of a lag to adapt to it. They're more affluent, around over $100,000 plus, annual income. And they're all urban or suburban. So, that's obviously, as we get into that range anxiety, you're not looking at somebody who's in a rural area that has a very long commute one way or the other, where, currently these EVs just don't make sense for them. So, or charging stations for that matter. So I think, you'll see that as being the case, but I do see that there's a huge amount of what we call intenders. And these are the people who, although are currently in an ICE vehicle, they do intend within the next 24 months to buy an EV. Now, a lot of that is going to be relative to what's going on in the economy, the gas prices. So as they continue to go up, as they have been, obviously that probably pushes the timeline a lot sooner for some of these folks. But at the same point in time, I think we had this huge rush I guess we did this once, kind of surveyed consumers back in 2021. And at that time, gas prices were high. And then all of a sudden they dropped way down and completely changed the direction of, what the buying public was looking for. So I think that a lot of that and those economic factors will obviously, kind of work their way into it. But as these people continue to look, as these OEs and as you mentioned, some of these newer brands kind of come into the marketplace, VinFast is another one that now you're offering all these additional choices. I think people are going to start looking at it. So they will start gravitating to that as their next vehicle, or at least one of the two vehicles in their house. So that way they maintain an ICE in case they're taking any long trips. And then for their typical day-to-day commutes, they'll enjoy, driving around in an EV.
One of my personal things, and in 10 years, I envision these things called personal grids or microgrids, different things. But more people are going to have their own power generation at home, whether, solar or wind. It's
Right.
most likely to be solar. And I've had other people I've interviewed on here that are doing bidirectional chargings. You sell your excess solar power to the
Right.
grid, and but you charge your vehicles, and at night, you run your house off of your electric vehicles.
Right.
And people don't realize these are enormous batteries that could run your house for like 3 days off of the battery, but you're going to be recharging it during the day anyways. But anyways, then you power the house at night, and especially let's say you live in California where they have the price of electricity is different depending on the time of day, but you're going to be powering from the car during their peak times. So you're going to avoid their peak times. You're going to save the grid from needing that excess energy, and people are then going to be, they're not going to be so. I think people are going to be so less concerned. We're going to start seeing a low range car having 400 miles. Currently, a high range EV is 400 miles, and you're going to see that being kind of on the low end, probably. I think
Right.
then we're talking 10 years, and the high range ones are probably going to be like 1,200 miles. And
Right.
so people aren't going to be so worried. It's like, well, I could drive halfway across the country without having to charge, so that's not
Right.
really such a big issue. But it is interesting to see how that's changing up. I live in the Midwest. I live in Nebraska, and we haven't seen widespread adoption of EVs here. When I talk to people, most of them still have all these misconceptions about what's going on in the industry. But the thing is, too, you look at the prices of most of them want SUVs. And if
Mhm.
you look at the prices of SUVs, well, they're not cheap, and we don't have a Tesla dealer here, okay, or we don't have a Tesla location here. So the
Yeah.
vehicles that are being offered, aren't the same. Although you see a lot of them driving around here, a lot of people order them anyways, and you,
Sure.
you do have a lot of those vehicles here. What are your thoughts as far as what you've been seeing on affordability and fuel and maintenance?
Well, there's no question, the federal tax credits definitely when you apply that, and I think that's one of the things that retailers today could use to help educate those consumers, because that's obviously one of the biggest things. When you look at the price, you're like, well, that's just way too much money to spend on something that I'm not even that confident in. But then when you break in the federal tax credits and you put it all out there, and then you look at maybe 5-year cost of ownership based off maintenance and whatnot, the EV play in a lot of cases can be a much cheaper option. So I think it's, as we discussed a little earlier, those prices are going to continue to come down. Now, as long as those tax credits, I think, stay available, at least in the near term, as those prices come down, it will continue to drive that adoption because those people will recognize that as a better value long term, as far as, and even we don't really know what that long range age of those vehicles are, right? We know over time the batteries degrade. They don't hold the charge the same as they used to. You get into similar as your cell phone, right? You don't want to charge past 80. You don't want to run it down past 20, but it's not always easy to live within those ranges, and it's just not convenient for a lot of folks. So as those batteries continue to go down over time, what is the life cycle? Is it 8 years? Is it 10 years? Is there a way to just replace cells in the battery, to maintain that life longer? Or is it 10 grand, 15 grand, and I got to replace the whole pack and start all over again?
Well, I'll tell you that as far as I know, the EV companies aren't doing like Apple, making it so your battery starts failing after 2 years. Where they're doing it in the software, you know,
Right,
so that's not an EV feature. I think that's part of where people get a little bit of the range anxiety, or they think the batteries are going to wear out, is because they don't realize how much the phone manufacturers actually have done this planned obsolescence of your phone.
right,
And so I've seen some reports that are saying that or battery degradation is about 10% every 100,000 miles. And most people don't drive a car 200,000 miles and keep
right,
it that long. And so if you're still only talking about a 20% degradation over 200,000 miles, that's not really that serious of an issue. And even then, people talk about what's going to happen to those batteries. They can be used for energy storage for other purposes. They don't necessarily have to go to recycling or any of that. There's still uses for that, because there's going to be big uses for storing renewable energy, because one of the problems we have with solar and wind is there's a time mismatch as to when peak generation is versus when peak usage is already. This is one thing, and this I know isn't probably part of your normal talk, but as living in a home versus living in an apartment is a big difference. And this is one thing that's hard, I think, to see people getting that are renters getting major adoption of EVs. In the United States, about half of people rent. So I think you're always going to have some issues with that. And that's a place where probably hybrids make way more sense, is for people who rent. And that's something that people talk about. We want everything to be EV by 2035, and trying, all these countries are trying to mandate that. You have to figure out something for those people who live in apartment buildings,
right,
because it's certainly not convenient for them to charge, and they don't necessarily want to start adding a 30-minute trip to a charging station to their daily routine.
right.
And currently, most of your adoption of vehicles has been that. I think one of the number one reasons why people actually trade in an EV is simply because of the fact that they have a housing mismatch, and it's not so much the other. I've noticed in California, because of the extensive California rebates, there's a lot of EV only used car dealers. And because you can get part of the federal rebate, plus you get a big state rebate, and you
Right.
can start getting some nice used EVs for less than $20,000. And there's some pretty nice programs. Also, the federal rebate it has to do with the battery components. So there's only something like, on a purchase, there's only like 12 vehicles out of 50 something that are offered in the US that are electric cars that are eligible for the full $7,500 rebate. But if you lease an EV, that changes completely. It's like almost all of them are eligible, or most of them are eligible if you lease. And
Right.
so it's made leasing really a different thing, whereas leasing's really fallen out of favor with normal sales, in the auto dealer space. Um, so what do you think that auto dealers need to do to attract more people to be interested in coming in and checking out EVs?
Well, no question, it's educational, right? And I think part of it's been that most of these retailers, because of the offerings, have been limited to a model or two. But now, as we continue to evolve, and you're going to have more offerings, for a while Ford just had the Model E, right? Now they've got a Model E, and you've got your Lightning, and so there'll be other models that are coming right behind that. So now all of a sudden you've got maybe a corral of EV vehicles that customers can come in and find something that really does fit their needs. You know what? I'd rather have an SUV, or I'd rather have something that's more of a truck. I need something that does more for me. So you have more options available to you. And I think that's going to be part of it, is those offerings. I think Tesla, to me, has always been kind of somewhat of an Apple, in that it's just, there's a lot of novelty to it, even if somebody isn't maybe a true EV buyer. But because it's the thing to have, you got to have your car, especially in California. I noticed that a lot early on. I do think that that's been kind of the hook for them. But now, as all these other companies come and they have legitimately attractive and high quality and new tech coming, and Tesla's jumped on board now with the bi-directional charging, as you talked about, but that's something that a lot of the other OEs, Ford especially with the Lightning, have had. So it is going to be a neat space to be in as we continue to go through this process of how quickly the technology evolves, because it is evolving, and it's fun and exciting because it's something new and different, whether that's improvement in ranges. I've seen, they're looking at aluminum sulfur batteries as kind of the next iteration of where we go. And then that eliminates a lot of the raw material China dependency that all these battery companies will have, or all the companies will have who want to build an OE or build an EV rather. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of how this landscape continues to evolve. And, gosh, you could throw a dart at a dartboard. I think it's anybody's best guess as to what it looks like. But for the retailer, it's really finding out what the customer needs, making sure that you are able to kind of appeal to that, whether it's a pricing situation. So do you have low cost options? Are your teams fully knowledgeable of how those tax credits work, how best to apply them? Before you couldn't apply them, not in all states. I think at the time of the deal, it was something that you bought the vehicle and then you sent away for it, and then you kind of got that. Now, I think within 2023 or it's the start of next year, you're able to start applying that into the deals as you're writing them up. So does make it a lot more attractive for a consumer because they do automatically get to take advantage of that right at the time that they sign the contract for the vehicle. So those things will definitely help. But one of the biggest things, if you think about it, is what company, and Cadillac's done a pretty good job of it, but have really marketed their EV vehicles. I mean, Ford did none of that on a marketing level. There were no commercials. There was really nothing about a Mach-E or their Lightning. They just, demand was there. And now that most of those buyers, and I think that's true for all EV offerings out there, most of those buyers already have one now. So now we need to convince and start educating the public who were on that intender list of why it makes sense to come and buy an EV, because there's lots of them out there sitting on showroom floors waiting to be purchased, and is trying to find those buyers who make a good fit and can afford those vehicles.
I think one of our problems here, particularly in the US, is we have our politics are very black and white. There's no gray in between. You can't be
Yeah,
in the middle. You either have to be extreme this or extreme that. And unfortunately, EVs have gotten stuck in the middle of that. And uh, whether I feel, if you compare like Air Forces in 1935 were flying biplanes, and in
right,
1945 they're flying jets. Well, what's going to happen is the ice planes are going to be the biplanes in 1945, and the
right,
EVs are going to be jets in 10 years. And I'm fearful for certain things in the industry. One thing is in the auto dealer, so these franchises,
sure.
they make money off of selling new cars, but they make more money off of selling used cars. The other thing is service.
Mhm.
So what's going to happen? What do you see the future for these dealers in the service as ICE vehicles slowly dwindle off?
Yeah, the ones that we talk to recognize that the habits of that consumer are going to be different. So I think it really is kind of trying to figure out how to meet the customer where their expectations are, right? And to me, a lot of that is going to be, maybe it's mobile service. So now that we aren't dealing with hazardous materials anymore with oil changes, I could come to your driveway and do a tire rotation and inspection on your vehicle right there. So there's no
Mhm.
need for you even to come into the dealership. I can make your life so much easier. So the convenience and offering that convenience for those customers, I do think that maintenance plans, subscriptions, as you're seeing a lot of these EV companies start to do, will become kind of more of that. This is how a retailer continues to see revenue come through, because to your point, there'll be less service visits, and when
Mhm.
they do, it looks like currently, definitely the cost is a lot higher than on a routine visit on an ICE vehicle today. But again, you're seeing the customer maybe once a year as opposed to twice a year. So, and really all they ever need to look at is a tire rotation at that point. Maybe it's a filter change, but in the long haul, I mean, their big expense is going to be tires, maybe
Mhm.
brakes. But with regenerative braking, even that is less than what it would be on an ICE vehicle today. So there's definitely going to be challenges from that regards, but to me, I think it's going to be how do you continue to meet the customer and delight them in the aspects that they want, and to me, they will continue to do business with you. And that's if you can come and show up at my place of work or wherever, maybe I'm stopping at the mall today, and you want to come by and take care of my vehicle while I'm there, that would be great.
So,
Do those kind of things.
so more of a white glove service type provider for those past buyers. That makes a lot more sense.
Well, and I think from the sales side of it, you'll see most of those consumers may turn into complete online shoppers as opposed to coming into the store and working that deal. They might do it all remotely and expect you to come by their house and drop off their new vehicle. They may never even show up at a store. I think that's a very real possibility.
So what are you seeing with the EV dealers? And I realize you deal with dealers all over the country, uh, comparing the prices of EVs to the normal ICE vehicles.
Well, again, when you factor in the longer term maintenance costs and the federal and state tax credits where they apply, I mean, it really at this point is either a wash, or maybe in some cases it could be even a little less costly than it would be. But as we kind of talked about those hybrids, I think that's a nice mix, and maybe that's your gateway to the EV, right? I was an ICE person, now I'm in this hybrid world, and the next time I'm going to fully transition and go EV. So that could be how we continue to move consumers over into the EV world in the long term. But I think from the retailer perspective, the customers that have been coming in for EVs understand, and they're much more educated about the vehicle. So when they come in, it isn't a sticker shock. They kind of know what they're getting into right off the bat. And then it's just a matter of, okay, what I wasn't clear on is how the federal and state tax credits work, and what does that truly make my payment on this vehicle. And as we talked about, do you want to lease it because it's much more attractive if you do that versus a buy?
Right. No, I get that. I get that. The there's certainly a lot of challenges are going to be facing the OEMs. One of the things that I see, this is just is U.S. adoption of EVs is lagging behind. And you're talking about the hybrids. I see other tech coming out too, where currently gasoline is like what 30. When you burn gasoline, you're only burning it at 31% efficiency. And I've seen some tech out there that I've seen the patents. They're saying they're getting up to 54% efficiency and combining some things with hybrid tech. I'm seeing some concepts that may drive hybrids to 200 miles per gallon on fuel and double the horsepower of say diesel, and some things like that. And so I think you're going to see some interesting tech. They all definitely are carbon reducing. All these
Right.
ideas are carbon reducing because they're reducing your reliance on fuels, and I think you're going to see some different plays in that regard. But I do wonder what's going to happen to like Ford, GM, and Stellantis, at least in the domestic market, if they don't adopt. Obviously, Tesla has things figured out. I mean, it seems like Tesla's 5 to 10 years ahead of everybody else, and it's a challenge to kind of see the people catching up. I heard was it Jim Farley or whatever from Ford? He was talking about they have 150 different software vendors at Ford, and trying to make everything talk is a problem. They're trying to for EV bring their own IT people in house to try to write that software for the EVs, and they're just years behind Tesla. And any thoughts on that?
Well, I do think that there are some others, and I don't know that I'm allowed to speak to one of them because I was there when they were talking about it, but they've done where they have a single control module in the vehicle for their EV. And so it negates that whole thing that you're talking about where I've got processors from this one and I've got this over here, and how do we make this all work? They have like a single source of, kind of a computing center that manages everything. And I think it's brilliant. So I do think, and I never bet against the OEs. The two things I never bet, one is the retailers. I never worry about them because I don't care what's happened in this world. They have always found a way to continue to make money, and be more profitable than they were the year before. I mean, they're masters at it, and I think they always will be. So I don't worry about them, but I also think, the OEs, although they have to move slower because they're just such larger beasts, I do think that they are, for the most part, figuring this out, right? And the other thing we haven't really talked about is, as this continues to go on, there'll be a lot of mergers. Some of these smaller EVs, maybe it's a Rivian, maybe it's somebody else, will end up probably getting bought out by a much larger, maybe it's a Stellantis, maybe it's a GM, right?
Hmm.
So there'll probably be fewer EV companies, 10 years from now than there are today, and there'll probably be a larger conglomerate of sorts. But so I think that, if you get to that position where we just aren't adapting fast enough as a company, well, who is? Can we go buy them and just take all their intelligence and figure out how to use our mass manufacturing production facilities and turn something into a profitable vehicle?
What do you think are the threats for Tesla? So Tesla's, they're different. They don't have the dealers. What do you think are the threats are for them?
Well, to me, I think they're threats to themselves. Right now they're kind of leading the game, if you will. So at some point, they've got to continue to evolve, and it sounds like they're doing those things. They have this very inexpensive EV vehicle, which they're getting ready to announce, and see how that goes. But I do think that they will probably be in the driver's seat for a very, very long time. But without question, as more and more of these competitors have entered the marketplace, their market share has dropped. I think they were around 75, 77% a couple of years ago, and it's, about 10% less than that now. So as there are more choices, people will gravitate towards where they go. And a lot of the research that we've seen shows that those people that buy an EV tend to stay loyal to that same EV company. So if they didn't buy a Tesla, their next EV most likely will not be a Tesla at that point, unless they just had a very bad experience. But again, that may also change as we continue to have more and more offerings from all these other companies. And this is very intriguing. I'd like to see what this is like. So it's going to be a very dynamic, changing landscape, and it's going to be interesting. But I don't think that Tesla's biggest enemy is probably going to be themselves. They've already
Interesting.
done the hard stuff, right? They've already figured out how to operate in these states without having to have franchises and franchise agreements, and that was arguably their biggest hurdle. And so once they've gone through that, now it's just a matter of continuing to delight customers and provide great products. And if they can do that, they have nothing to really worry about it for a long time.
You're probably aware that for Chevy, the Bolt is the one vehicle that has gotten the most people, or for GM, to convert to GM from another brand, and that they've really ever had. And it's really been interesting to see that it has been an EV that's done that. I think one of the things is in kind of the more affordable sector, and not that the Model 3 is really terribly affordable from Tesla. That's where they're hoping to address it with that Model 2. But the Bolt just isn't that attractive of a vehicle. And so it's tough to kind of fit some of that in there. And I've looked at some other things, like I had, there's a new Nissan that's called the 20-23 that looks kind of like a Porsche 911, that's going to be a nice, probably inexpensive little sport car that it's probably not going to be replacing like the 350Z or something like that. It's probably going to be, I'm betting it's going to be just a really inexpensive car that's going to have fancier features that,
Right.
I'm just saying, you've got to have some things that give a little bit of flash. I mean, like the Mach E and the Lightning, I mean, they're nice, but they certainly they went to cater to that high-end market. And so that's one of the things in the US that I don't think there's been a real good job of catering the lower end market. The other thing too, I'm a big guy. Okay. I need a larger vehicle. And so the idea of driving like, a BYD or a Neo, one of their small cars isn't very appealing to me. And
Right.
I don't know how big the VinFast SUV is, or crossover that they brought to California. Do you know, is VinFast doing dealers, or are they selling direct, or what are they doing?
Right now, they're selling direct. I don't think they've started to look at a franchise model. So I've seen, I was out in Orange County, and there's a big Irvine Spectrum Mall there, and they have a location there where you can come in and see and order and pick a vehicle out. And they have a couple models. There are two models that they both have, are both there, and they look great, and they're not that expensive. And so, if they have quality and can deliver as promised, they very well may have a future. So it's just it's fun to see, the great part about the competition is it just pushes everybody else up, right? Rising tide floats all boats. So I think as these companies come out and new technology is introduced, it'll be adopted by others, and other people will figure out ways to improve upon it. And you're just going to continue to see, I think, a huge transition in this technology over the next 5-10 years.
VinFast doesn't really have a good reputation for quality, but if you look at all the manufacturers in the United States, Tesla has the most, issues per 100 buyers or whatever by
Right.
far
Right.
of companies that make cars in the United States, but they're usually just real little things like how body panels fit
Right.
or different things. There's been issues on the build quality just isn't quite the same. What do you think are going to be the hot markets for EVs in the coming years?
Well, for the most part, typically what you see is the consumer, whatever type of vehicle they're in today, they tend to transition into everything seems to be SUV right now. So whether it's a small SUV or larger SUV, that is almost where every customer transitions, or whatever they're in, they want the next size up in that vehicle. So if they're in a mid-size vehicle today, first choice would be an SUV. Second choice would be a larger size vehicle. With the exception of when you get to sports cars, then that's all bets are off. But
Right.
typically, it's going to be that small mid SUV range is where I think you're going to see most of that market go right now.
I think VinFast was smart to come into the US with a crossover. I mean, worldwide, the Tesla Model Y is the best-selling vehicle.
Right.
And, being a crossover, I think that was probably a good choice to pick. This is a mistake where Lucid came in and decided they were just going to make cars, and now they're pivoting and they're going to try to have an SUV out next year. But
Right.
I think hopefully that wasn't too late for them. They claim they have the cash to sustain their mistake, but it's interesting kind of to see that. Well, also in the EU, I've seen people trying to push for making laws that you outlawing the sale of SUVs in the EU. And I don't think that's going to get a lot of traction. But their whole thing is everybody needs to be in small EVs, so we have the least impact possible. And
Right.
what a lot of people would like to see is the transition from cars back to buses, and trains, and which is kind of fascinating. And you and I both know that's not happening in the United States. You
No, not
know,
anytime soon. That's for sure.
no, and but that a lot of these other cultures, those other forms of transportation are much more widely used,
Right.
and so some of them would like to see that, and I find that kind of fascinating. It's like, well, the U.S., you got people like Ford who basically got rid of cars, to only do SUVs and trucks, and
Right.
you see that here. Then in the EU, they're trying to say that the governments need to force the car manufacturers to stop producing
Right.
SUVs
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Exactly.
it's just the wrong direction. But anyways, is there anything else you'd like to add today, Brian?
No, it's just like I said, it's a very fascinating space, and it's going to evolve. And I think a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, we could play this back in a couple years, and it's going to be completely different than what you and I talked about. And obviously, we look to the future. I think the next evolution probably comes down to hydrogen.
Mhm,
Europe has already invested heavily into that technology. I think BMW and Mercedes especially.
mhm.
So that seems like it's much more viable, and obviously from a raw materials, critical minerals standpoint, it's less impactful. So but that's still 30 years away, I think, before we see anything like that happening. But who knows? Necessity could negate it and have it come sooner rather than later. But it will be interesting to see, this point, like 5 years from now, what is the market share? Who's got the best game? Are there any of these large OEs that are uncompetitive? Maybe it has to do with what's going on with the unions and that whole deal, does that take them out of being able to offer a good low cost EV vehicle into the marketplace? It's a lot that's undecided.
We'll consider this. So 10 years from now, let's say that half of all cars are pure electric vehicles. Okay, worldwide, not just in the
Yeah.
United States. And then of the other ones, let's say that you now have 150 mile per gallon range on EVs because of different, or not on EVs, I'm sorry, on hybrids
Yep.
based on the different technologies. So what happens is all of a sudden your use of gasoline for cars has gone down, let's say by 80%. Well, how does that affect the price of gas?
Right.
So if your average price of gas right now in the United States is about three and a half, $4, probably $4 a gallon right now. And a lot of that is taxes, but a lot of it is the oil itself. But if all of a sudden that's a dollar and a half or $1.70 like it was about 3 years ago here in the United States, or even less, it might only be a dollar. So let's say you're talking a dollar gas, then you're seeing different uses. Obviously, gas is still used in plastics and all these other things. So you're never completely getting away from having fossil fuels in some way.
Well,
And
it's
the other
used in
thing is,
battery production too. Don't forget.
yeah, well, but there's some things like jets.
Right.
Jets don't. To have propulsion, you have to have a gas.
Right.
So, so you can make, I've seen where there's battery powered turboprops coming, as the batteries get lighter and more powerful with these solid state batteries, you're going to have some actual electric aircraft, but they're not going to be jets and they're not going to be rockets going into space. So you're still going to have, some interesting things. But anyways, that's more for another day,
Yeah,
different
for sure.
discussion. Yeah, uh, Brian, I really appreciate you coming on today and having this chat with me. And I'm hoping that people will watch this in the future and they'll see, your opinions on what auto dealers and things are going to have going on. And they'll get great value out of this. So
No, it
I'm
was a
gonna
I'm sorry. It was a great discussion, and like I said, I love talking about this. I think it's fascinating. It's one of my favorite things about being in automotive all these years is it's always something different every day, and this is kind of the latest and greatest, and it's going to be fun to see where this goes.
great.